got some issues. I'll admit it, I ain't perfect. Blow you up, but you don't answer on purpose. Say you busy, I assume that you ain't working. I've been feeling like there's more under the surface. I got my wallet when you call up, boy, I'm guarded. I'm so guarded. You leave me broken hearted. All I want is a nigga who gon' ride for me. A nigga like you won't even try for me. I'm a ride or die bunny, need a clock.
Hello, everyone, and good afternoon. My name is Kalisha Davis, and I am the CS Equity Curriculum Project Director here at the Kapor Center. It is my sincere honor and pleasure to welcome all of you here today for the Digital Divide. Computer Science Equity Requires Connectivity. Next slide, please. If you're new to our work, Kapor Center is a national organization headquartered in Oakland, California, dedicated to removing barriers in STEM education and tech careers for underrepresented people of color. This webinar is the second in our series of conversations that we host monthly and is a direct result of the Equitable Computer Science Curriculum Initiative, a national endeavor launched earlier this year designed to cultivate meaningful approaches to creating more culturally responsive and asset-based practices in computer science education. Next slide, please. Today's presentation will cover the following. We'll receive a formal introduction to this topic by my colleague, Dr. Allison Scott. We'll have a conversation with our distinguished national panel of experts representing such communities as Detroit, New York, and Oakland, California, to name a few. And finally, we'll have some time for Q&A with our panel before we say farewell. While you're listening, if you have any questions for us over the course of this presentation, please feel free to drop them into the Q&A box, and we'll be sure to address as many as we can. Next slide, please. Without further delay, please allow me to pass the mic to my colleague and the Chief Foundation Officer at Kapor Center, Dr. Allison Scott. Allison?
Sorry about that, I was on mute. Thank you so much, Kalisha, and hello everyone. My name is Allison Scott and I lead efforts at the Kapor Foundation to close equity gaps in CS education and to also expand diversity in the tech sector in order to ensure that communities of color can thrive in the tech economy. So today, as many of you might know, is the National Day of Action for Internet for All, a day of action which is led by education activists and organizations across the country. And so we are super excited to be joined today by a group of panelists from across the country for a conversation about how closing the digital divide and ensuring students, particularly low-income students and students of color, have the technology and broadband that they need to learn and thrive in all subjects, but particularly in computer science. So we know that the digital divide is an old problem, but one which became a glaring and urgent issue in light of the COVID crisis. Nationwide, between 15 and 16 million students do not have access to the technology they need to participate in distance learning. And once schools transitioned to remote learning in California, for instance, over 1 million students lacked the access to a device or broadband needed to continue their learning and to access lessons and instruction. And actually 5 months later, as school is starting up again, despite a bunch of efforts, there are still over 500,000 students who are disconnected. And we see the same trends across the country. The vast majority of the disconnected students are low income, rural, and/or Black, Latinx, and Indigenous. So how did we get here? We know the digital divide is a deep structural barrier, which has often been talked about, but we have not yet addressed systemically. So why does the digital divide matter in terms of achieving equity in CS education? A few examples. Can you imagine the difference between two students in an intro to CS course? One can participate in CS instruction, the other cannot. One can access resources like Khan Academy, Code.org code studios, tutoring websites, and explore careers online, the other cannot. One can have small group coding lessons online or in a pod, while the other must rely on a shared device and unstable internet to try to access basic classroom instruction. As CS educators, we know not all, but much of CS instruction happens with some form of device and connectivity. And for opportunities for students to create, to code, to create products, to experiment with trial and error. So it's not hard to see how COVID can widen existing gaps in computer science education. When we think about equitable CS education and ensuring all students have the opportunity to participate meaningfully, develop strong CS identities, and make connections between CS and challenges in their communities, we also must consider the very conditions in which we are situating computer science instruction. I will stop there because I'm very excited to hear from our panelists about the challenges and solutions to the digital divide, what it means for computer science equity, and how each of us can get involved and take action. So with that, I will kick it back to my colleague, Kalisha Davis, to introduce our panelists.
Thank you so much, Allison, for providing that helpful insight about how this issue connects to equity in computer science. So with that in mind, let's spend as much time as we can with our fantastic panel joining us today to examine the digital divide and its impact in U.S. cities. So it's my pleasure to introduce you today to Amina Fazula, Equity Policy Counsel for Common Sense Media, Joshua Edmonds, Digital Inclusion Director for the City of Detroit, Lily Gangas, Chief Technology Community Officer and my colleague at the Kapor Center, and last but not least, Anthony Sanford, who serves as Broadband Adoption Coordinator for NYC Connected as part of the Mayor's Office of the Chief Technology Officer. Thank you so much to each of you for being here with us today. So let's start with the basics as it relates to this topic. This first set of questions is really for any one of you to answer. How would you define the digital divide? What's the most appropriate definition of it?
This is Amina, I'm happy to start the conversation. The way that at Common Sense we've defined the digital divide through the lens of students and families is lacking access to adequate connectivity into devices to be able to do distance learning or other critical work.
Wonderful. Any other thoughts to add?
I could chime in on the second part. I'd say it's more like a economic, educational, and social inequality that just adds to societal disparities that we're now dealing with. So it's just another area in which people that have and people that don't are continue to trail behind. So.
If I can jump in just to also give it additional coloring into what is some of the discrepancy of like, what is it really? And I think even the word digital divide for a lot of folks who may not be aware has been around since I was in high school, since I was in college, which is over 20 years ago. And we've been talking about the digital divide since, right? And so thank you so much for hosting this space because I'm super excited to start the dialogue, but also move to the solutions of what that means. And if I can just add a little extra on this topic, because it's definitely something that I've been so passionate, especially from my own lived experience. The access to laptop devices, yes, right? The access to the internet, yes. But the question, how fast? And so now we are at the time that we need to be ensuring that it's fast enough and it's reliable. And I think that we also need to start thinking about not only once you have the connectivity, the device, but are the students, the families, the people who are using it, are they digitally, do they have the basic digital literacy skills? And I would also like to bring into the discussion some of the issues around data privacy as we start to get more of our kids and families, and also just caretakers that may not be too familiar with a lot of these softwares and tools that sometimes they may be engaging for the first time. So I just wanted to add a little bit more of that into the discussion as well.
Thanks, Lily, for adding that context. Really important areas. And so, like you mentioned, that this is something that's existed since you were a young person. When did it become clear that this was a problem, especially when it comes to like schools and young people having actual access? Again, this is open to anyone.
Sure, and I can start in the sense of saying I think just the times that we're in, this is a problem that has been going on for many years. Like back when I was at USC in the 2000s, there was a specific that was specifically aimed at taking this on, right? But the reality is that there's a lot of monopolies that I think we need to be addressing. And with COVID-19, the fact that we went digital first overnight, as Allison mentioned, it just opened so clearly the disparities that come zip code by zip code, right? And so I think that now we're starting to see where the districts and students and cities in general that didn't have a plan in place or weren't even in the execution phase literally just are leaving a lot of their students and residents offline. And when we have now seen that we're in this digital first where we rely on connectivity and device connection to get basic information for food, for healthcare, for jobs, it's become a basic need now. And I think that that's why these types of dialogues, and especially today, the fact that it's internet for all day, that I think it's time. This is the time to move more pressure both at the city, state, and federal level in all different angles, because we can't wait for another decade. We don't have another decade. We don't have another year, to be honest. And so I think we're all here to ring the alarms on this issue.
Following
So,
up, go ahead, Josh.
hey man, you wore the bow tie today.
I'll
Okay,
adhere to you, sir.
fine. Okay. So I'll say that when we're looking at the digital divide, Larry Irving is known for coining the term the digital divide. Larry was doing work within the Clinton administration, and really it came down to no different than the electrification of America. This is a resource misallocation issue. And so at the onset, when people began seeing the switch from the internet being a military thing, the internet being a consumer thing, we were already thinking, and in this larger vein, that, whoa, this is going to be a big issue. Now, I think that what no one could really predict was the ability for the internet to penetrate every single sector possibly. I mean, the kid case, like, we can go on all day and just see that one because it hits the closest to home. It's probably the easiest one to conceptually understand. But then as we look at things around bank functions and how online banking and how that works and how you have these communities that are underbanked historically, and then you tie that into the future of healthcare delivery, we've created this infrastructure that's based on convenience, but it's convenience for some. And so I think that this is a really nice convergence between internet all versus convenience for some. And at that intersection is where the digital divide exists, but there's multiple iterations within that that are influenced by whatever sectors we're in. And so again, at the very onset when this term was coined, this was the 90s, and we knew this was going to be an issue, but the rate at which we could address the issue has lagged behind the rate at which the issue has been able to grow, just given the sheer nature of what technology does anyway by existing on that bleeding edge.
Those are all really excellent points, Josh. I appreciate that, especially this idea of it being a convenience for some initially and not really considering the need for everyone to have access to these resources. So when it comes to that, like, who is most impacted by this particular disparity? I think you touched on it a bit, Anthony, and if you wanted to chime in, you're welcome to do so. But who experiences the most barriers?
So I think right now, and I'll further clarify this point later on, but I think one of the major people that are getting hit by it are the elderly. It's again, the internet probably came around, or it became big or known to our generation, the Gen X or the millennial generation around the 90s and stuff. But you still have this huge baby boomer generation that didn't need the internet, or it was just a passing thing, or the telephone was enough for them. Now that generation has aged, and certain things they need this sort of internet in order for them to just do their daily lives. One of the programs that I oversee is our older adults technology services, in which we're educating older adults on how to use the internet, how to just go on, and if they have a Facebook account, and reinforcing certain things, such as learning how to send an email, how to use the email, how to how cumbersome it is for people like us that are using emails all the time. And now you're asking somebody in their 60s, 70s for them to do it on a daily basis. That's a scary thing for them. So I think the elderly population is really getting hit by it right now.
That makes a lot of sense.
I would actually, this is Mina, I would just open it up to, it's hitting, to jump off of Joshua's comments, it's hitting everybody in really significant ways. I think the pandemic has really exacerbated and very quickly exposed, how we're all touched by the internet and how we're actually relying on it, even if we didn't understand that before. And it's especially important for, I think, policymakers to understand that because, for so many years, we've seen the internet as this technology that can help lower costs of delivering service and help maybe even create a new version of it that could be more efficient than in-person services could have been. But we've all done that. We've started to make those strides without actually ensuring that everybody has access. And so now I think the type of digital divide that I think a lot of us on this panel have been talking about, have been worried about, have been trying to close. Now we're seeing what happens when you have that digital divide during a time of crisis. When everybody is supposed to stay at home or try to socially distance, you can't go to the bank. You shouldn't show up to your healthcare provider. You can't go to school. You can't go to a library to use the computer. So, all of these services that you were able to kind of cobble together with some other help, if you didn't have it at home, now you can't access those things. And not only that, for the success of social distancing to work across the country, you want everybody to stay at home. And so if you are part of an elderly population and we want to protect those folks the most, we want to make sure that they stay at home and stay protected and stay safe. But then they're cutting themselves off from all sorts of forms of communication and enrichment in their life, and then just support in their life. And so, and the same in very different ways is true for kids, it's true for families, it's true for, all of these different sectors. So I would say that, there isn't really at this stage, I think we've seen how it's laid bare. And it not only affects the people who don't have access, but because the people who don't have access can't appropriately socially distance, can't appropriately connect to services, everybody else is impacted when those communities are forced to go out and seek help, right? And go out of their bubble and go out of a place of safety. That only furthers the spread during this pandemic and during this crisis. So I think we've seen now how we truly are interconnected and the value for people who are connected to have everybody else on the network as well.
And I would add to that as well, there were also the times where there's generational loss of learning that we're having. We're artificially capping the genius of the future generation, which is the part that we need to be making sure that it impacts everybody, but it's also going to have the longer term effects for the future that we go on. And so just for an example, just here in California, out of the 1+ million of students that don't have devices or aren't connected, 60% of them are of color. And so when we start to think about what are some of those most vulnerable groups within even that segment, we have to also think about the low income students, English learners, students with disabilities, students in homes that are in transition. When we think about what right now, the unit of the home, if you don't have a home, how are we even having being able to even connect to them? I think the number of students, there were some stats in LA that show the number of students that were totally disconnected. They haven't been able to get connected. Here in Oakland, we're still trying to get a better feel of what the number is, whether it's hundreds, thousands, 10,000s. I think that's one of the key issues that we really need to be bringing up in this aspect is that the problem is so huge that there's so many folks impacted, but it's also a multi-generational impact that if we don't take action now, and start to ask for more data transfer, for example, like what are we measuring? What is the level of disconnectivity, right? We opened the session with what does it mean? And we all had different aspects, but I think we definitely need to come into an area of when we start to think about what is the future year, 5 years from now, if this doesn't get resolved.
Those are all wonderful points, Lily, thinking about this as a long-term strategy. And with that, I think we should go ahead and dig a little bit deeper into all of the panelists, your areas of expertise and the work that you're currently doing to address this issue. So, Amina, I wanted to start with you. So Common Sense Media and Boston Consulting Group recently published a national report that examines this issue more comprehensively. And you're one of the lead authors of that report, correct?
Mm-hmm. That's
awesome.
right.
So kudos to you and your colleagues for creating this really timely resource. So you talked about this a bit earlier, like as far as nationally, like how are communities faring in regards to connectivity? Like, what were you able to find through this work and this research?
I mean, what we found was that there are about 16 million kids that are unconnected. And again, this is using existing data sets. So what we were scoping out is the full picture of the digital divide, not trying to address like how have efforts since March, helped close for some communities. But I'll be frank, I think a lot of those efforts kind of ebb and flow, right? Because maybe they sent out a hotspot, some schools took them back over the summer. Some schools deployed the computing device, those devices broke down. So, there's always going to be a little bit of ebb and flow. So our focus with this report was to sort of say, what is the large big picture number? How many people are really going to need this support ongoing? And that was that 16 million number, K through 12 public schools. What we found that in terms of who's doing well and who's doing worse in this country, we found there's no bright spot. And I think that's probably sort of the biggest sort of sad news of the report is that, there's nowhere in the country that's doing well. Every state has an issue with the distance learning digital divide. 1 in 4 students lack access to an adequate connection or a device in the best states in the country. So that's pretty stark. And we found that the vast majority of the students who were unconnected and lacked devices were students of color, were Native American communities, Black communities, Latino communities. There was a little bit more prevalence of the digital divide in rural areas, but there were also very high numbers in suburban and urban areas. And I think that starts to speak to some of the issues that some of the other panelists mentioned around competition and sort of just a lack of strong policies to require build out, because you don't have the same excuses in an urban or suburban area to have those high levels of unconnected students. It's not difficult to get the connectivity out there when you can't make that claim. And I think what we also found, and I would point this to anybody interested, is to take a look at Greenlining Institute's research that showed that districts that were subject to financial redlining practices from the 1930s were also those same areas that faced higher instances of the digital divide. So, like other panelists have said, this is something that is just an extension of the haves and have-nots, right? When you continuously treat communities poorly, when you don't supply them with the adequate resources, you don't prioritize them through policies like universal build out, you leave these communities behind in a whole huge different host of different ways, and connectivity is one of them. And then one thing that, we found, and I'm sure everybody's asking this, what do we mean by adequate connectivity? So we pressure tested our numbers with industry, with education advocates, education technology products, with state officials. And what we found is for, synchronous, high quality distance learning, which we would hope to have over the next year, you'd need speeds around 210. So 200 down, 10 up Mbps. That is hard to come by in a lot of communities. Certainly it can be expensive. So, those were some of the numbers that we found. We also found that you needed to have adequate computing devices. It was important to be able to do your work on something other than a cell phone. And for a lot of communities of color, their access to the internet is through a mobile device. A hotspot is a device that you can use if it is connected to an adequate computing device. And again, for students, you could use something like a tablet for younger grades, but as you get older, you really do need to have a better computing device. We also found that teachers were in this digital divide as well. So teachers weren't equipped with the right connectivity or devices to stand up distance learning. They were trying to upload sensitive student information from parking lots because they didn't have connectivity to be able to securely connect to their databases. And then we also priced out what it would take to close it. And we found that it would be a first year commitment of about $6 to $11 billion. And probably an additional $1 billion to close it for the teachers, where there are about 400,000 teachers that are in that distance learning digital divide. These are big numbers, but they are actually doable. You know, what we priced out was to meet the service that we outlined, right? To try to get closer to synchronous learning, to that 210. You know, those price points that we outlined with that 11 billion actually are pretty close. And considering the importance of keeping students connected, knowing that they're experiencing this summer slide plus this COVID slide, and with another year of distance learning, you know, and potentially more, it's really important that we invest now so that schools have the flexibility to set up learning however they need to, but also that students have the flexibility to explore their educational environment from the comfort of the home, from the safety of their home. You know, at least they're starting with the right equipment, the right connectivity. And so it seems reasonable considering the dollars that are actually going out the door for COVID relief packages that we make this type of investment for students.
Those are all really helpful points. That's a really helpful summary, Amina. From there, from this kind of national bird's eye view, Joshua, I want to be sure to invite you to be a part of this conversation. Can you tell us a little bit about your efforts here in Detroit? And I say here because I'm also in Detroit, which I'm a native. But what's part of the city's leadership in establishing your role?
So a lot of this can be attributed to our CIO, Beth Niblock. She's just an incredible champion for digital equity. And when the mayor was recruiting her for her role, she said, all right, but if we're going to do this, we need to be focusing on the digital divide. He's just like, sure. Didn't really understand what that meant, which that's much more indicative of the larger issue that we're seeing across the board when it comes to public sector leadership just being absent. And so when I see a lot of cities rallying around to do things, historically what you're going to see is just a lot of poorly funded nonprofits who are trying to steward this work forward. And it doesn't really get the sophistication that it needs to get the resources allocated in a way that's meaningful, because there's not that private sector investment that would then go to presumably these community groups. That bridge isn't being made clear. And I think that's because like you're missing that public sector angle. And so the fact that the city was like, hey, we want to get behind this. And I make a point to shout out cities like Detroit. And I'm not going to get into the naming ones because I'm just going to get political when I start naming the other ones. But for the folks who are engaged pre-COVID, that means something. That's something where we're saying, look, we're not responding because of a pandemic. I think that if you're building your digital equity efforts in response to a pandemic, I think you're already wrong. It should be in response to poverty. It should be in response to people aging in place, or that our ecosystems aren't being strong enough to move forward and we're going into a future that doesn't have to be uncertain. And so the city was like, all right, we want to focus on this. And mind you, my experience is working on the digital divide. I was working on Connect Home and public housing. I was working on, when I was working at the Cleveland Foundation, specifically investing philanthropically in this. I've been able to see this digital divide through multiple lenses. And the most recent one through the seat of being in the mayor's cabinet. That's something where now I get how these pieces are supposed to fall together. And so the shift has been from less on, let's release reports, let's release studies that tell us what we already know. Now it's like, okay, how do we operationalize? How do we, as net new resources are being made available, how do we add that to the mix of what we're doing, but how do we do it in a sustainable fashion? I've had funders who've asked me, well, Josh, what's it gonna cost us to connect every single household? I'm like, a cost bigger than any of us. And it's not because paying for internet connections is going to connect you. But like, yeah, sure, we can get to 100% connectivity today, but if we don't have a sustainable solution, then 5 years from now, that money's gone. It doesn't matter what we did. And so like, that's where I'm really trying to get people to realize that us operationalizing this, behind me, you might see right here, Connect 313, that is the, that's the branding that we're going. I know this might go right into the Q&A question I saw from the first one about what's being done. It's literally us, the city, saying, okay, digital inclusion is not bridged by one entity. No one entity can own it. It's impossible. It's too nuanced. And so what we said was, all right, we're going to create Connect 313, which for those who don't know, 313 is our area code in Detroit. But that is meant for us to say that it's scrubbing the city from it. It's scrubbing this from being a corporate thing. It's scrubbing from this just being a community thing. It is the umbrella for which everything lives under. It is the umbrella for which all of our digital inclusion, all of our activities, we have a digital equity fund. We have a data trust that's being stood up. So that way we know all of our data isn't just coming from the American Community Survey or any, like we are literally taking this and operationalizing it and putting it under one umbrella. So that way all this can move forward in a way where if the federal government were to be able to invest, we could say that we built a model that sits at the intersection of these various things, because they're going to keep asking us, well, where's the private sector? Well, they're here, they're pouring in. Well, where's your community? Well, they're here. Where's your city? Well, they're here. And so that is what we're building in Detroit. And that all came from, again, the leadership primarily from our CIO, who was just a great champion for this. So if there's any other cities who are trying to get much more involved, get a really, really good CIO, and I think some magic can happen.
Fantastic. It's a really interesting perspective on an intentional, sustainable model, Josh. And I know that's something you've been dedicated to since you came to the city, when we had our early conversations before I even joined Kapor. So I really appreciate your work on this. So Lily, I am looking at you virtually. I know that you've dedicated much of your time at Kapor to advocate for equity regarding this issue in Oakland, California. Can you tell us about the landscape of this issue in the Bay Area and across the state?
Yes, definitely. And just to also, before I jump into that, I definitely wanted to reiterate the points that got made about the amount of funds that need to be available that Josh and Amina also mentioned. At the national level, there's a House bill that got passed, 1.5 trillion, that was allocating specifically 8.8 billion. So when we start to think about these numbers, some folks may be like, oh my gosh, this is like humongous, we're never going to close it. No, the funding is out there. It's how is it going to get allocated? And without having specific plans, so like, I just really want to uplift what just Josh shared, because that is a type of models that are really missing from so many different cities, especially to be able to share that model. So that way, all these cities that maybe want to move forward, and now we'll put the Bay Area in a better way, like what is really our model? Well, how inclusive is it? And why are we like trying to put band-aids, right? And maybe there are a lot of different ways to share that knowledge. So then that way we can amplify and move this quickly. So I just wanted to uplift that as well. Specifically here in California, as we've shared some of the numbers earlier that really set the context, when we start to take a look at Oakland, where we have about 50,000 students, right? And when we think about how many of them are connected, who are they? About 66% of them are students of color. And the rough estimate at the beginning of March was that about half of them were disconnected. And the challenge is that the report that Amina put together in Common Sense, I highly recommend for the folks to check out this. There's one of the graphics that show the levels of this connectivity, because it is a little bit of a challenge where some students may have the device, but no internet, or they might have both, but they don't work properly, or the speeds are too slow. And specifically here in Oakland, there's been an effort to, about 2-3 weeks, a tech check survey was released. And granted, I would say that this is probably going to be the closer set of data set that will get to the truth of what are those different levels of disconnectivity. To Josh's point, having the data trust and having that as a clear part of the strategy to know what is the real gap beyond just what the ACS and beyond what the census data is providing zip code by zip codes is super critical, because we don't know when we get into some of these specific edge cases, we don't know really how we're really solving. So I'll just give an example. In the Fruit Belt, I know of students who have laptops, who have the Comcast waiver, but are too scared to log in because they're undocumented. Yet in all the systems, they're checked off as connected, but that's not the reality. And so we have to making sure that we are going beyond some of those high level stats to understand our community. And this is where having that clear transparency of data and holding the school districts accountable, holding your mayor accountable, holding your district council members accountable is really, really critical here. Specifically in Oakland, as I share those numbers, where the majority are students of color, low income, and now we have also a large population of English learners. So there's actually a different set of problems challenges that without having a much more inclusive design and designing really for some of those edge cases, we won't be able to solve it for all. And so I just wanted to share some of those stats. On the positive side is that from the ones that have gone surveyed so far, the need is getting better assessed. So about 70% of them are saying that they need a laptop. About 20% of them are saying they need internet. And on the Oakland perspective, Tech Exchange has been the partner on the ground, and they're shipping about 1,000 Chromebooks per day. And by the end of the week, they should have crossed the 5,000 mark. The challenge, again, because there's positives and opportunities of how to get better. Some of the numbers show that most of the students have gone loaner laptops even before some of the Oakland Undivided work got started, which has been a focused effort over the last 2 months here in Oakland. About 80% or so the students were reported to have a loaner of some sort. And then now there's this opportunity to provide a more permanent devices, but the students who may not have either is the one that we're trying to really dig in. What is that exact number? What zip codes are there? And what is the income level? Because then we start getting into the equity discussions that our community here in Oakland has been very vocal about. And so I definitely want to make sure that that we're putting that and centering any type of strategy around that area. So then that way we are closing the gaps for the ones that are in the most need and with more urgency.
Thank you, Lily. This is really great information. I really appreciate your points around collaboration, doing the actual research to address the nuanced needs of the communities and people that you're serving, and to be really intentional. Again, I think that's been a consistent message that's come across from all the panelists. So for Anthony, I just wanted to be sure to include you in this conversation before we move into Q&A. So can you tell us a little bit about the city's efforts to address this problem? Why was it important for the Office of the Chief Technology Officer to be established? I'm guessing that it might be very similar to what Josh has shared, but anything else that you want to share about what you all are doing in your community right now?
Absolutely. And just like all of the other panelists have said already, you know, if you weren't like doing this work pre-COVID, you were kind of like catching up and everything. So really this is a good time to be in this space. So to echoing what my panelists have said, leadership is everything. So my leadership, we pretty much, what we're focusing on, we put our initiatives into 4 buckets. The first bucket being universal broadband, the second one being digital services, the third being inclusive innovation, and the fourth being tech policy and future planning. Allow me to just share our website with all, and I could drop it into the bucket as well. It's tech.cityof.newyork, all one word, .us, and it'll give you a full picture of what we're doing. But in terms of the projects that the mayor's office is doing, you know, so our infrastructure and service delivery, we have a pilot program in which we focus our efforts on Queensbridge houses, which is a NYCHA location, aka public housing, and we pretty much went in there and we have a subcontractor that acted as our backhaul for affordable broadband. So some of the areas that we focus on with all of that, which is in our Queensbridge Connected program, one area is we're looking at the universal solicitation of broadband, which is pretty much focused on the NYCHA locations, on providing safe and affordable connectivity for NYCHA residents. In addition to our connected NYCHA, and I alluded to this earlier, our older adults area that we're focusing on. So we partner with the NYCHA administration in order to have a digital van going around to specific areas. And for people that live within these NYCHA areas, if they don't have an option of using internet, they could come out into the vans. It's brand new. It's very well taken care of, and you could just come, use it, and then go back to your area. The other area that we have focuses is our digital inclusion efforts, which I pretty much spearhead, and that's a collaboration between the 3 library programs, Brooklyn, New York, and Queens. And some of the references when I'm thinking about it, references the old BTOP program, the Broadband Technology Operations Program from the Obama administration. So that's always a really, really good thing to continue to remember and know that there is the funding out there for us to continue to do this programming. Our other partners are the Parks programs, the Parks Department, Department for the Aging, Department for Youth and Community Development, and of course NYCHA, which is New York City Housing Authority. In addition to why our office is continuing and trying to just drive this home is because it's important. In addition to we publish reports. This was our Truth in Broadband report. This was our 2018 report. And our most recent one is kind of like the Bible right now. It's right next to me. It is our New York City Internet Master Plan. And this is pretty much the spearhead as to how we're going to take New York City into the next 10, 15, 20 years, in addition to building collaborations, building communities. The one thing that I find is that the technology is a great connecting tool, but it's really the people aspect that is going to continue to drive the technology. Yes, there needs to be a continued investment in education of how we use this technology and overall investment to getting better wiring, better cables, better millimeter wave technology, all of this stuff. That has to happen, but it's still nothing unless we're reaching the people that we're serving. So I'll take a step back and listen towards any questions that anybody has for the panel.
Thank you so much, Anthony. I really appreciate that and what's happening in New York right now. People definitely make the difference, in any form of service that you want to provide to whole communities. It really does matter. And so I definitely want us to get into the questions. I did have a general question as far as what people can do, what educators, advocates, others that may be on the call with us, how they can support this issue. Maybe we can revisit that in the last few minutes of our discussion today, so we can maybe make some room for the questions that have come in already. Let's see, what's it looking like? Let's see, so we do have a few that have come in. Okay, so this first question is from Janie Fernandez. And she says, what does an ideal collaboration among organizations look like in order to address this issue? Which key stakeholders and sectors should be involved? Are there existing partnerships working on initiatives to move the needle for more equitable access to connectivity? Anyone can answer that question.
I'm happy to start the discussion. From a very narrow perspective, I think that there is a new player, newish player on these issues, and that's schools. Schools are really taking on connectivity and digital inclusion in a way that they didn't before. Before, it was called the homework gap, and there's a hodgepodge of solutions that you might offer on like a worksheet to a family if they're seeking connectivity. But it wasn't really put on the schools to really track or help close. Now schools are seeing this as a big part of their duty because they need to be able to equitably deliver education. And so they now know that they've got a role to play. So they have a capacity to gather data in a way that can be repetitive, refreshed quickly. That's really unique for the digital inclusion space. It takes a lot of effort to do this type of data gathering that everybody's talking about. And certainly you want to have your own, but you do have now this amazing resource if we can kind of get them to the table with everybody else, which is, really asking the right questions of their families and their students. And you'll suddenly have information on service providers, speeds of service, quality of service, whether you have a device or not, down to an address. And that's really impressive.
Yeah, I'll say for Detroit, we were a bit spoiled, to be honest. So with respect to even the schools, so we were able to raise that $23 million of private capital. This came from our corporate community in response to all the work that we were doing, kind of teaming people up, so that when it was like, oh, we need to go remote, it was something where we had already had the relationships built for us to be able to activate and get 51,000 laptops and connectivity out, to the point that that was a shared thing between the school, our energy provider, several of our corporations, our foundations in the city, all working together, because that's where we start getting at that operationalized approach. That anytime there's an issue, we don't have to worry about trying to go figure this or that out. It's like, boom, we can go. And so, now we're having the same conversation about, okay, how do we look at our seniors? How do we connect our seniors and more of this stuff? We don't have to, go back and, herd all the cats. We're already still here because we made that investment earlier this year. So literally anything that we want to focus on, we can keep doing that over and over and over again. And I think that's the model where I would just continue to stress that, one time is cool, but we have to continuously do this. But at the same time, everyone has to feel supported in this. For so long, you have digital inclusion leaders who are literally by themselves or on islands. And if you're that one entity, if you're that library, or if you're that school, a lot of times when they do that by themselves, they get burned out. And so as a result, you're going to find some resistance to partner, even when you have really great ideas. For some of the people on this call or who are asking questions, might have some really great ideas that can really help, but you might run into, when you first try and engage with them, this, because it's like, look, we've seen it before. This problem is so freaking hairy. Like, if you're going to help us for the long term. And so that's been the vision that we've been conveying in Detroit, that look, this is going to be a historic issue. It's a long-term issue. We don't get out of this tomorrow. We can't spend our way out of this. We need to build a way where we have the relationships that are going to live here. And if, for instance, one person walks away, we have the institutional commitments to keep this stuff going forward in an operationalized capacity.
All really important points, Joshua. It's so important to have people in place that can carry things on. If something happens to someone, who's going to take that work and move it forward? You have to be coordinated and thoughtful in those efforts. So this next question comes from Winald Ronelis. Beyond the digital divide, the real issue we are facing right now is digital skills. How are you all approaching this issue?
I can share a little bit of some observations, and also just add to the last question from the stakeholders, because I think it's so critical. Amina said who are the emerging stakeholders? I would also like to add the other emerging stakeholders are transportation. So here in Oakland, for example, the AC Transit on their own trying to extend a line in the Fruitville area, which tends to be some of the zip codes with the lowest income, just by creating them, they're like, you know what, we're going to add fiber. So then that way we could actually connect it. And therefore, this wasn't, coordinated with other sites of the public sector. They decided to do it because they need it on their own, which gives us whole opportunity, right? And so I would just say that's an example of a stakeholder that we need to really be bringing in and start to think of our communities. If there's anything with the pandemic that I think hopefully has helped some folks get to know their neighbors and know that we are in this together. It's connectivity and it's interconnectivity at the city level, at the neighborhood level, and I would even say at the home level. And I would add an additional stakeholder there, that is the parents who are now part-time teachers. And how are they being trained? So just adding to that, and that kind of takes me to answering your question of what is the reskilling and the upskilling. There's also here a huge issue where a lot of the jobs, there was a stat that's about 60% of the jobs now, you can only find them online. And so if even for those part-time teachers who are the parents and now are also displaced out of their own work because they didn't have the opportunity, or whether to work from home because they didn't have connectivity, or they're still working as essential workers, right? There's here a huge opportunity in general to rethink our workforce revitalization. There's a lot of jobs that can be created by helping solve the digital divide. If there's infrastructure and funding that goes along to go and build it, those are jobs that can be created. In addition, there's also the huge need to help some of the workers that tend to be in the areas that got the most disrupted by COVID, that now has to be online, like retail, for example, right? And so how are we rethinking and providing opportunities for upskilling and reskilling? And so here's where we're going to see a lot of new opportunities from even CBOs, community-based organizations, have been providing. They're going to continue to come and shine, but there are a lot of initiatives at the national level. SkillUp.org is a coalition by, I believe, 20 plus different organizations. Of one of them, which is Bitwise, which is a Kapor Capital company that's been focusing on helping provide resources, but also provides opportunities for folks to get those digital skills wherever they are at in their journey.
Let me chime in on that. So for the Connected Communities program here in New York, we again, we're partnering with the 3 library systems, because we find that libraries are a safe space for people to just come in, spend hours on hours at a time, and then do what they need to do. So there's train the trainer programs that we have, in addition to for our parks programs. They start, I want to say, as early as right before high school, that they're teaching kids about media skills, have full scale studios in which they can start transitioning to non-traditional jobs, which I was blown away at the way that these kids are learning different digital skills and stuff. So the skills are there. You just have to kind of go online, start perusing areas such as what New York is doing, such as what Detroit, California is doing. And word of mouth also helps finding things out. I spoke about community, how else do you know something's really good, like unless you're getting it from people that you trust. So once they're engaged, and again, there's always that need for continued investment, marketing for CBOs to come out and say, if you don't have this skill, we're offering this at a low cost or even free. Just come in, check it out. What COVID has done, unfortunately, you don't get that foot traffic that you could come in and see more skills that you would typically see in like a library or in any place that you would normally see. But now we have an opportunity to go online on trusted sites and see, because they're all detailed out there. So that's one of the areas that New York is doing. We found that it's really working. We're nowhere near where we need to be, but we are seeing some traction on people like taking these jobs, and the numbers are showing it. So when I'm meeting with my partners on a monthly basis, we have performance report reviews. We're having conversations about how can we continue to tweak the strategy. I mean, and this was even before COVID. Now that COVID is real, now it's like, okay, how are we monitoring the virtual participation? How are we getting the message out? So that's what we're doing here in New York.
Okay. Thank you, Anthony. I appreciate you sharing that insight. And I know we're getting close to time, but we also started a couple of minutes late. So I'm wondering if we can maybe go a couple more minutes just to be able to try to address some of these additional questions that have come in. So let me go to Dr. Theophiles. Your question was, how do your organizations think about addressing both the digital divide in terms of access, but most importantly, the digital literacy gaps? Everyone can have a pencil. Everyone will use that pencil differently.
So I'll say that, part of what we're doing with this whole Connect 3-on-3 approach is we're focusing on things in a committee, subcommittee, board, executive committee, community advisory committee fashion. And pretty much what I'm saying is various levels of governance. And specifically creating recommendations that are much more in line with where we want to be based off of where we are. And so one of the recommendations that we've came up with, if you're thinking about this in a bucket form, we have one on devices and connectivity, but that pretty much just looks at like devices in the community and households and connectivity form factor. Are we talking about connectivity from a broadband standpoint, a symmetrical standpoint? Regardless, it's a lot of nuance there. Digital literacy, digital skills, what do we mean by that? What's best for Detroit? How is that going to position us as we look at the future based on where we currently are? And then we have another area about special projects, and another one on advocacy and ecosystem. The special projects one, we are focusing on a neighborhood technology hub network where we're looking at the existing sites in our community, such as the libraries and existing digital literacy training organizations, primarily your social service ones, but at the same time also looking at homes that can be rehabbed and then converted into these digital literacy hubs, and specifically using our larger community coalition to begin driving recommendations that make much more sense for where we want to be. So it's one thing to say, all right, we're going to do basic digital literacy training, doing the North Star assessment to see where our populations are, then doing the IC3 certification and then the A+ certification. Sure, that's standard. What we're saying is like, how do we take that approach of the standard and then go one step further to make sure that our content's engaging? How do we marry this with now getting our kids into recording studios? Heck, you like rap, you like podcasts? Sure, let's actually marry this existing digital literacy training with that. Getting people involved through esports. I mean, we're literally trying to take as much of this stuff as possible because historically, yes, people have been able to adopt and take advantage of this stuff, but let's be honest, at the same time, this stuff is really, really dry sometimes. And so being able to take where people are and their interests are, and then weaving that into this collective thing, so that way they don't have to go to maybe a library that's not in their neighborhood because their neighborhood library closed. We're actually now creating these additional spaces for people to feel comfortable to do that learning, but as part of a larger structural conversation.
Love that, Josh. So it's all about those community supports and really broadening and leveraging what you have available to you to be able to provide more to more people. So I have another question that came in from Sharnice Wingate. How can members of those communities that need these trainings and equitable access to connectivity find out about these programs and offerings? Is there outreach that's done?
I know that schools, I guess my husband, I know that schools are doing this type of outreach right now. That's one resource. Unfortunately, a lot of other places are closed right now, but I know that there are reopening efforts in libraries and other community broadband organizations to be able to do this type of outreach in an appropriate and safe way. Just gonna.
I would add also that this is the opportunity to reimagine how parent engagement and community engagement has been done in the past, right? And so I think that specifically here on the Oakland side, there's a big push to really leverage all these amazing community-based organizations that have the trust of the community that unfortunately the district for some have not provided, right? And so I think that this is really the new model to be. And I would love to have a side conversation with the folks here, just even reimagine what that looks like and creating a model. Like right after this, I'm so pumped up to be able to be like, all right, let's call our governors, let's go down and sit down, because I think that there's definitely something here that could be uplifted. And I do think that there is a great need to really, really also invest in some of those community-based organizations. As we were talking about earlier, there's a lot of funding that's coming out. In California, there's about $5.3 billion that was approved by the governor for an executive order. But what I learned is that can't be used towards devices that students keep, because you're not allowed to do that. And so does that provide an opportunity to augment the staff? Does that provide an opportunity to fund some of these cross-sector collaborations more effectively and be able to show that, you know, we are all working as a unit of change?
Mm-hmm. Awesome, Lily. Thank you for that. So I know we are running over just a bit, and I want to make sure that I get you all out of here. I want to take this question from Beverly Thomas. And then we will close out. So Beverly says, you've all addressed the most at-risk communities and how they are being affected. With $1 billion to allocate, where could funds be applied to have the biggest initial impact?
This is a
I'll,
nope, nope. Go ahead. Go ahead.
I'm gonna just slide this over right here. I'm gonna cover my bow tie and everything. So, given $1 billion, this would be fantastic. We would be able to take the New York City Internet Master Plan and put it to work for all parties New York City related. I would say to everybody, especially in the New York City area, take a look at this. I'll drop it off in the chat. It gives a detailed description of specific areas that have strong connectivity areas, have maybe not as strong connectivity areas. There is a plan in here to take New York into the next 10 to 20 years. There's a subsection for digital inclusion. Just about everything that this entire office is going for. This is the template that we are looking to deliver to New York City. In addition to, we can, given more funding, we could run more cables, get better cables, to connect to public housing areas better. Money, like, you can do so much with that money, particularly here in New York City. But I'll adhere to Josh now.
I'll just say with $1 billion. So Anthony, you took that directly to New York. I thought that was meant to be an American thing, but that's fine. I like it. $1 billion in Detroit, I'd go nuts. That being said, I believe if we were to actually look at like American cities that have the 2030 conundrum, the 2030 conundrum is pretty much you have a lot of these urban cities with pronounced minority populations where 20 to 30% of them don't have internet of any kind as relates to the ACS numbers. That 2030 conundrum is really, in my opinion, and it's more than opinion, but it's a direct result of the lack of investment that we've seen historically in these urban cores. We've seen the rural case play out so many times, and that's not to say that they shouldn't get anything, but I think that if we're able to demonstrate, $1 billion, in my opinion, is a demonstration that can these models stand the test of time. Right now, if we're underfunded, there's no real way of saying that. And so these models never get the chance to scale. We never really see what we need to see. With $1 billion, we'd be able to do that. The current bills right now in the House and the Senate, they're good. I think they're great starts. But again, can these models be tested with the capital allocations? And so that's what I would be more so looking at, to say that there's $1 billion that goes out. What did we learn? Where did we win? Because if I'm looking at the Rural Opportunity Fund that's getting $20 billion, I wonder what the lessons being learned are that are even applicable to the large urban cores like a Detroit or a Chicago or a Cleveland or whomever else.
Awesome, Josh.
I'm just going to add really quickly,
Yeah.
let's put the dialect from $1 billion to $1 trillion, if not more, because I do think in the short term, there are those data gaps that need to be closed, specifically for some of our students who want to go into the high tech. When you're in high school, that's really your critical year to get hands-on experience on creating robotics, CS, different types of programming that requires speeds, and also laptops that have a processing power that nobody has right now. Those Chromebooks that are being passed out are not going to be enough for them. And so I would definitely encourage more of some of the short-term funding to go towards identifying and closing the needs for those students that need that processing power. So then that way they can solve, they can be the STEM majors that we want them to be. And this goes back into college, because a lot of the students right now are doing distance learning. When I was pursuing my electrical engineering degree, there was software that there was no way that, first of all, I could afford. But then my poor little desktop back in the day didn't have the speed. So I highly relied on the university resources. And a lot of those students don't have that. So I think especially as that is also a short-term lens of what we're also discussing.
Awesome. Thank you, Lily. So this has been a really great conversation, and I don't want to take us too far over. But panelists, thank you so much for sharing all of your insights, and thank you to our audience that's still with us. We didn't want to leave without sharing at least a few resources. Next slide, please. with you. So you heard all today about this Common Sense Media report. Definitely look for that online. It's available and it offers a great deal of really solid information about this topic. The Connected Futures Initiative in Detroit, and then the Day of Action that Allison brought up earlier. It's actually happening today, the Internet for All campaign. So feel free to visit their website for more information about that. And it just happens to be a coincidence. So we offered this webinar today. And then just for your information for next month, we will dive into national perspectives regarding diversity in computer science with our colleagues at Google and Gallup. This is a refresh of data that they featured a few years back in 2015 and 2016. And so just please stay tuned for more information. Stay in touch with us. Next slide, please. Feel free to join the initiative and be a part of these ongoing discussions. And we look forward to seeing you all again soon. Thank you so much.
Thank you, panelists. Thank you, Kalisha.
Thank you.
Thanks, Allison. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks.
Thank you so
Thanks,
much,
guys.
panelists. You all are
Everybody.
awesome. Anthony, were you saying something? I'm sorry.
Oh, no.
Okay.
Bye, y'all.